The man who needs no introduction, the former Auditor-General of Malaysia and member of the Selangor Royal Council, Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Dato SETIA HAJI AMBRIN BUANG, and the rose among the thorns, Miss MUNIRA MUSTAFFA, former analyst of SEARCCT and Malaysia's Defense Intelligence Organization. Wow, beauty with brains. And of course, the man in this very nice uniform, Lieutenant Colonel Abdul MUJIB Haji Jafar, Acting Director of the Royal Brunei Armed Forces, RBAF Religious Directorate. May I welcome the moderator, Associate Professor, together with the panel of our speakers to kindly move on to the stage. They're seated over there. Please, kita beri tepukan gemuruh pada sekalian as we welcome our moderator and our panel of speakers. To begin this morning conference, a bit on the moderator. He is the Associate Professor with the Department of Strategic and International Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Universiti Malaya. Associate Professor Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers in 2012 obtained his PhD from the International Islamic University Malaysia. And his research interests are government and politics of the Central Asian Republics and Xinjiang. He is currently the head of department, specializing in international relations, foreign policy analyst, and also taught at the Malaysia Armed Forces Staff College and Malaysia Defense Armed Forces. He is one of the media resources persons for Radio and Television Malaysia RTM, Astro Awani, and Bernama TV. He is formerly Deputy Executive Director, Development Research Innovation at the Asia Europe Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, a topic of very important, utmost interest, talking about national integrity and security. I wish to welcome the moderator to take over the floor.
Thank you very much to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you. It's indeed an honor and privilege. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning to everyone, especially to the esteemed panelists, and of course to all who are present here. You are great heroes who have stayed back until the last day. Thank you very much for your presence. And this morning, we have a very important topic, as was highlighted by His Royal Highness Sultan Nazrin, in his keynote address. Today, we have one of the pillars for this year's conference, that is national integrity and security. And when we study about security, we don't just need to focus on traditional security. Yes, no doubt, traditional security is absolutely important. Issues related to border security and, of course, armed forces, weapons and all. But on top of it, integrity is absolutely important as well. Because if you don't have integrity, you can put as many soldiers or prepare the nation in terms of security-wise, weapons, it is of no value, because if the country or the society lacks integrity, that of course integrity in a simple definition, one may look at, say, honesty, being loyal, right? If you don't have these elements, therefore how prepared you are, it doesn't make much difference. And leaders need to have also strong integrity. And I can't think of another person apart from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a man who have given us values of integrity during his lifetime. As example, while he was leading the Muslim community in Medina. Although myself being a not-Muslim, but I have great admiration to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Yeah. So this morning, as being mentioned by the MC, we have eminent speakers from different or very diverse background. And of course, we have Tan Sri Dato SETIA HAJI AMBRIN BUANG, who has vast knowledge from his experience, be it in serving in the ministry and currently as a Deputy Chair of the Board of Trustees of Lembaga Zakat Selangor. And of course, he was formerly the Auditor-General of Malaysia and various other ministries. So a man with a lot of experience on the issue of integrity. Apart from that, we have Dr. HELLYER. Of course, the man doesn't need much more introduction. For those who have been here since Monday during the dinner and the opening ceremony, Dr. HELLYER have contributed throughout this conference. So, and of course, he a man who have a lot of experience, now currently the Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute and Senior Fellow at the Center of American Progress. So, as I said, he doesn't need much more introduction. He was here with us. And we have also Ms. MUNIRA MUSTAFFA, who have served before with SEARCCT, the Center for Counterterrorism. And also we have Lieutenant Colonel ABDUL MUJIB HAJI JAPAR, who served with the Royal Brunei Military. So here we have very diverse background from the civil servant, from the armed forces, a researcher who have done a lot of study on terrorism, and also Dr. HELLYER, an international renowned scholar as well. So without further ado, may I invite Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Dato SETIA HAJI AMBRIN BUANG to start off the discussion. Tan Sri, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'm truly honored and delighted to speak before you, sharing my thoughts on a very significant topic of national integrity and security. At the outset, I would like to mention that I fully agree that there is a nexus between integrity and security. And the connection is very important indeed. We know that personal integrity generally refers to an individual's moral values and behavior, covering values like honesty, diligence, sincerity, and trustworthy in discharging one's work and responsibility. National integrity, however, is much broader because it would cover institutions and bodies which are involved in delivering a country's or an organization's vision, mission, and priorities. A small group of individuals which is lacking in personal integrity can create problems and havoc to security while threatening and destabilizing a country's peace and socio-economic prosperity with negative consequences that may impact the life of citizens. Likewise, security should also be seen within a broader perspective, not just about military and police capabilities, but also economic security, financial security, food security, energy security, cyber security, border security, environmental security. These are all also important sectors and should not be ignored as they contain various challenges and risks which may bring negative consequences and impact the lives of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, most people would agree that national security is not protected solely by military strength or law enforcement. It is protected every day by the integrity of public institutions, the accountability of leaders, the speed and fairness of governance, and the political will to act. Nations that institutionalize integrity prevent fraud, corruption, and abuse of power before they occur. In doing so, they preserve public trust, strengthen democracy, enhance economic resilience, and secure a safer, more prosperous future for generations to come. These linkages are really clear to most of us. But today, I also like to discuss both integrity and security in the broader context of good governance. being pursued by a country's public service because it is relevant to emphasize the crucial role of the various levels of government that are entrusted with the responsibility of ensuring peace, stability, and prosperity of their citizens by showing the highest degree of integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, based on my experience in auditing and investigating public sector's governance in Malaysia, I have red flagging instances of fraud, corruption, and gross negligence of people handling public money that could trigger losses, leakages, and opportunities for both the government and people. I observe recurring weaknesses across the public sector, such as weak project planning, poor procurement practices, delays in implementation, cost overruns, poor contract management, abandoned or underutilized projects, weak internal control, poor asset management, revenue leakages, inadequate monitoring, repeated non-compliance with financial regulation. A very long list indeed. Now, these findings, unfortunately, are not isolated incidents. These are recurring systemic weaknesses. To me, it is meaningless to audit or investigate the public sector's governance year in, year out, if there is no speedily follow-up action through appropriate corrective and punitive actions taken promptly by the offenders. The public always demand accountability whenever there is fraud, corruption, leakages, and abuse of power. Ladies and gentlemen, to me, integrity and security are undoubtedly very important pillars of good governance. In fact, integrity is the foundation of good governance, whether in public service, NGOs, or in business. Good governance rests on the sustainability and consistency of actions and not merely words. It encompasses accountability, competence, transparency by public officials in undertaking their responsibilities to ensure an efficient and effective public delivery system. To illustrate, good governance means public institutions must be honest in decision-making, transparent in the use of public funds, accountable for outcomes, fair in enforcing laws, and efficient in delivering services. Governments are being judged on their honesty and competence to prevent mismanagement and shortcomings from happening. Prevention, however, is not an easy task. So, for example, if corruption in defense procurement occurs, it will weaken military readiness. If corruption continues at the borders, it will facilitate smuggling, human trafficking, and illegal immigration. If financial governance is weak, it will encourage money laundering and organized crime. Also, if corruption happens in environmental regulation, this will contribute to illegal logging, pollution, and floods. If there are weaknesses in healthcare procurement governance, this will threaten public health security. So, indeed, there is an extensive list of security vulnerabilities to ponder. Therefore, integrity is not simply an ethical virtue. Without integrity, even the best laws, policies, and institutions become ineffective. If I may elaborate, ladies and gentlemen, good governance is not merely about complying with rules and regulations. It is about exercising power responsibly, managing public resources wisely, making decisions transparently, and always placing public interest above personal or political interests. Good governance requires strong commitment and action on integrity, transparency, the rule of law, competency, ethical leadership, and effective oversight. What is needed is that these principles are consistently practiced to empower strong institutions, which will earn public trust and strengthen national unity, economic confidence, and political stability. Conversely, when integrity is compromised, the consequences extend far beyond financial losses. Ladies and gentlemen, let me next touch a little bit on corruption, which always receives wide publicity nowadays. That most people now would consider it to be not as an economic crime, but as a national security threat. It is very obvious to us that corruption can weaken strategic institutions, can reduce public confidence in government, increase organized crime, facilitate foreign interference, weaken investor confidence, widen inequality, and create social instability. When citizens lose trust in institutions, national resilience is weakened. Questions arise how prevention, which is the first line of defense in fighting corruption, can be effective. Not only nations fight corruption after it occurs, but nations must build a governance system that makes corruption difficult to occur and certain to be detected and addressed when it does. Furthermore, preventing fraud and corruption is far less costly than investigating it after public money has been lost. As we are aware, investigations, prosecutions, and recovery efforts consume enormous financial resources, valuable time, and institutional capacity. They often take years to conclude, while damage to public confidence and national reputation has already occurred. For governments to effectively prevent corruption, a strong internal governance is needed. Effective internal control, transparent procurement, segregation of duties, risk management, independent auditing, and vigilant oversight will, I believe, significantly reduce opportunities for fraud and abuse. I think most people would concede that corruption in the public sphere is unavoidable in society, and that it would blemish the image of good governance that can cause a national embarrassment internationally. But government needs to do more to prevent corruption and not allow corruption to worsen. Ladies and gentlemen, concerning national security, for many, national security cover a wide range of sectors. Very crucial things like protection of sovereignty, constitutional democracy, economic resilience, financial stability, food and water security, energy security, cyber security, environmental sustainability, and so on. Such a broad spectrum indeed, and they extend beyond military defense. It is true that national security is often associated with soldiers, police, intelligence agencies, and subjected weapons. But actually, we can witness that many nations were weakened not by external enemies, but by internal failures of governance, corruption, and abuse of power. Security is often mentioned in terms of threats, and nations have to be wary of that. Most of us will agree that there are other serious threats to national security besides external aggression, terrorism, such as cyber attacks, pandemics, climate change, or geopolitical instability. They would operate quietly, often unnoticed, yet have the potential to weaken every institution upon which the nation depends. The main threat actually is the erosion of integrity and accountability. To address this threat, it is imperative that the nation must have public officers who are committed to protecting the economy, its institutions, its public finances, its infrastructure, its environment, and perhaps more importantly, the trust that citizens place in their government. I believe, therefore, integrity is not merely an ethical principle, but also a strategic national asset. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, when integrity is strong, institutions function effectively, policies are implemented efficiently, public resources are protected, investors are more confident, and citizens trust their government. Conversely, when integrity is compromised, corruption flourishes, public money is wasted, services deteriorated, institutions weaken, and public confidence decline. It is obvious that national security begins not only at our borders, but also in every ministry, department, and local authority and public agency where decisions involving public resources are made every day. So let me consider accountability. Undoubtedly, integrity and accountability are inseparable. Integrity prevents wrongdoing. Accountability would ensure consequences when wrongdoing occurs. It is easy for us to understand that without accountability, mistakes are repeated, negligence becomes acceptable, corruption becomes normalized, honest officers become discouraged, and public confidence deteriorated. As we know, a nation may have excellent laws, regulations, and procedures. However, without accountability, they remain merely words on paper. I believe, therefore, the true measure of governance is not the number of regulations we produce, it is the consistency in which they are enforced. I need to stress again that in the context of good governance, where accountability is weak, governance deteriorates, good governance prevents abuse of power. Accountability corrects failures, deterrence discourages misconduct. Together, they protect public resources, strengthen institutions, reinforce public confidence, and safeguard national security. Accountability and deterrence are very essential principles for governments to operate if they are serious in preventing and fighting corruption, taking into account the opportunity costs of corruption and the actual cost of combating corruption. In terms of opportunity costs, the cost might be frightening if efforts to combat corruption are not effective and impactful enough. Consider each right or dollar lost on corruption, fraud, wastages or leakages represent opportunities denied in terms of building more schools, hospitals or clinics, flood mitigation projects, more scholarship to deserving students, not to mention police equipment, defense assets, clean water supplies, rural roads, digital transmission, affordable housing, etc. Some may feel that corruption still survives. First, it's still public fund. Second, it's still opportunities from future generations. Be that as may, we can perhaps deduce that the cost of preventing corruption is much less than the cost of combating corruption. With regard to leadership, question arises as whether leaders strongly believe that public money is secret trust. Do they realize that every ringgit or dollar entrusted to the government carries a moral obligation to be managed wisely? That the whole position of trust and not merely a position of authority. Always mindful that public money represents the hope of every citizen for better education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security. There has to be ethical leadership in action, not just words. When leaders demonstrate honesty, impartiality, humility, and courage, these values cascade throughout the organization. Lastly, political will. Political will is indispensable toward the success of any integrity system. A nation may have excellent laws, comprehensive regulation, independent audit institution, anti-corruption agencies, and code of ethics. Yet, if those entrusted with authority lack the determination to enforce them fairly, consistently, and without fear or favor, this institution cannot achieve their intended purpose. Simply, political will is demonstrated by decision and action, not by speeches, declaration, or policy document. Let me conclude by saying that I have expanded the nexus between national integrity and security into the broader context of good government. I believe that the true strength of a nation is measured not only by the sophistication of its weapons or the size of its armed forces, but by the integrity of its institutions, the accountability of its leaders, and the trust of its people. We need to prevent abuse of power by having good governance. Accountability corrects failures. Deterrence discourages misconduct. Together, they protect public resources, strengthen institutions, they enforce public confidence, and safeguard national security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri, for laying the foundation for our discussion. And I was very much attracted to what Tan Sri have mentioned, where there are two pillars, security and integrity. You can have security, but if you don't have integrity, the security efforts may not be fruitful. And this is so true if you look from history, the rise and fall of empires, right? Many empires have very strong army, but because towards the end, the lack of integrity that have contributed to the fall of those empires. And again, I'm very much attracted to the government or the Kerajaan of Medina that was led by Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, that it was really a state with a model state with integrity. In fact, the first constitution, one of the earliest constitution, was actually in Medina, long before the other constitutions that we have today. So, while we have heard from Tan Sri, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri about integrity, today now we also would like to hear from the security, and we have someone from the armed forces, that is Lieutenant Colonel ABDUL MUJIB HAJI JAPAR. And because this morning's presentation, we have papers presented, like what we heard from Tan Sri, and we also have another way of for discussion of more of question and answer, like what we had in the previous session. So may I ask Lieutenant Colonel Tuan, from your experience serving in the Royal Brunei Armed Forces, can you elaborate a bit from your personal experience, all right, on the issue, the link between security and integrity? The floor is yours, Tuan.
Thank you, Dr. Moderator. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good morning to each and every one of you. First and foremost, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Universiti Sultan Azlan Shah for the kind invite for Brunei Darussalam to participate at the significant conference among world Muslim scholars and esteemed panelists from different background and specialty. Again, I express my personal gratitude to our distinguished moderator and every fellow panelist here for the brilliant inputs, especially Tan Sri, which stated and had shared a few critical inputs, especially on the system, especially on the impact, especially on how the public perceive the importance of integrity and the impact towards security. What I would like to highlight here, among one of the few sharing that I would like to share, is that in my research, because currently I'm doing my doctoral research in the military governance, so that the focus is actually on the Islamic governance. So we talk about how the system works. We talk about how the impact of lacking of integrity and the impact towards the security. But the key element here, the similarity, the convergence of all, is actually the human agency. So when we look into security factors and how does it impact towards our livelihood, is that human being, we are the problem and yet we are the solution. It's quite unique when we talk about Islamic civilization. How many civilizations have fallen because of human being? The right question for myself when I reflect towards this is that how Islam has taught us from the beginning, especially at the opening conference, that the importance of human being. I would like to highlight this because the narration, the citation was so beautiful. It touched myself, especially in the context of building integrity and security for the people. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. So, all mankind, we created you from male and female and made you into nation and tribes, and that you may know one another. Truly the most noble of you that before Allah is the one with the most taqwa. Each and every one of us stand in front of Allah. And the concern here now is that how can human being is not liable and breaching the security? And we've seen this in the context as mentioned by Tan Sri and your kind words, Doctor, that the shaping of the mind and the background, especially on the cultural aspect, is that the key for us to ensure that everyone is being taught on the impact of breaches of security. Because before the breaches of borders, especially from my aspect of view, the military, the first breach is towards the human being, the dishonesty, that the lack of integrity, and the niyyah, for example. And it shapes the important that why we stand here, why we discuss from day one until now, and why Tuanku mentioned it back in a very eloquent way, that the importance of human and the impact of the teams. What the next one that I would like to highlight is that the impact of maqasid and understanding the maqasid as Sharia, the strategic objective of maqasid. Everyone just think that maqasid is a separate entity. But actually when we look into the maqasid, we are also looking into the Maslow hierarchy. We are addressing the needs of the people. We've discussed this among one of the discussion was that people sometimes feel unhappy. But what made them unhappy? And how we can address it in accordance to Islamic perspective. It's not just about giving what they need. It's also shaping the human being to understand how they can be happy in front of Allah, and with that consciousness, especially for the Islamic, in this Islamic civilization discussion, is that we need to build the mindset. Because coming back from myself, because I was trained from Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. So with my religious background as well, so I've seen different civilization, different backgrounds, different set of expectation. But one of the key elements is that we lose ourselves because we want to become others. The national identity for us is to preserve ourselves, to become who we are in accordance to our belief. And this is important for the national integrity and security. Because we're not just talking about what we're losing. We are talking about who we are and who we want to be. And in accordance to national integrity and security, this is so far more important. Because when we, especially as Tan Sri said, the formulation of policies, the rule of law, that we've seen nowadays is we require to embody such trust and belief so that we don't lose ourselves in these vast challenges of the rule of law, for example, the disrespect towards the rule of law. And it is important for us to understand that each and every one of us are accountable for. We are accountable with our knowledge. We are accountable with what is our action. And this is quite critical, especially in this World Conference, that we come up as scholars, as formulators, as policy analysts, as researchers, that to look into this, what are possible action that we can do? This is not just about producing papers, ladies and gentlemen. This is about how we can do, what we can do, and what we can change. And I would like to highlight one of the Prophet hadith. عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. I heard the messenger of Allah said, whoever of you sees an evil, let him change it with his hand, and if he is not able to do so, let him change it with his tongue. And if he's not able to do so, then with his heart, and that is the weakest of faith. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about breaches of integrity and security. But what have we done to do so, to change it? This is why, as Tan Sri rightly, and I would like to echo his position on that, we must look into the gaps that allow people to deviate. I'm not here to preach, and that's not my role today. But what I would like to call each and upon all of us to ponder upon, especially when we see something's wrong, have we ever stand against it? That is the humanity. That is the basic that we can give towards other Muslims. And this is crucial. This is crucial why I would like to highlight, based on the research that I've done, especially on the ethical values and requirement, because taqwa itself has mentioned in the Quran for 258 times, with different contexts, different requirements. People can say, oh, that's just a bit theoretical. But the problem now is that we are lost. We don't even have a theory. We want to become everyone, and everyone doesn't have the identity anymore. And because of that, when we look at the current problem about integrity, we need to go back to the human agency. Human agency, who we are, what's wrong with us, and how we can fix it. Islam has taught us a lot, and you said it looked earlier before about the Constitution of Medina. When we look into the Constitution of Medina, says and ma'am, ladies and gentlemen, it is quite unique. Because when the Prophet came to Medina, people already have their law, tribal law. But when the Prophet came in, he made people to sit together and then believe in one law, that they must abide at certain belief. They must respect each other. And this is what lacking nowadays. Because we've seen so much Western that we lose ourselves. And this is the critical part. When we talk about national integrity and security, we are talking about the Western definition. And that Western definition has a different approach. The perspective is different. And now, when we look into the unity in Islam, when we look about the Islamic thought and civilization, the worldview is Islamic before we start. That's why the conference began with the opening that remind us about taqwa. And that taqwa is not just about telling everyone to pray. It's about embodiment, the value, fear of dishonesty, fear of breaking the trust of the public. And it is important, especially coming from the military, that we are trained for discipline, that we are shaped to follow orders. So how do we come up with this when we embed it with Islamic thoughts? So it is quite crucial. I would like to highlight and call upon everyone not to become a military, no, but to reflect on the values that we can embody today, especially on the honesty, integrity, taqwa, the consciousness, the fear. When no one's watching, that is who we really are. Again, sirs and ma'am, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about values as the Islamic foundation for civilization, Quran said it over and over again. We've seen it from theoretical parts and into implemented and into now what we can take over as a conceptual crossover. Those theoretical from Quran, we've seen it successfully implemented during the prophetic era. But we forgot, because all the modules, all the models, the governance models that we took is so Western that we forgot the most intrinsic part is that the fear of Allah. We fear not just because of law or fear of being caught, as Tan Sri rightly highlighted, but we fear because we are failing the responsibility and the leadership, the accountability when no one is watching. And this conference is a statement to that we must find a way to ensure the future generation will not lose themselves. And we must stick true to the identity of Islam. Again, I would like to highlight, taqwa are not soft value. Instead, they are hard strategic assets, especially for years ahead. And taqwa is not a present that being given, we can give to everyone else. It must be trained, it must be taught, and it must be implemented. And we cannot judge the taqwa of others. Because when we judge the taqwa of others, we are losing one of the context itself. And nowadays the problem, sirs and ma'am, ladies and gentlemen, it's easier for us to judge. Talks become cheaper, and we are lacking of reflection. Muhasabah. And Islam has taught us this. Reflect on yourself before you can judge. And when there's nothing good can come from our side, just keep silent. And those are the sort of things that we need to address nowadays, especially in the context of the Western globalization. We have become so westernized, sometimes we forget who we are. And coming because I studied from Al-Azhar University, and also I went to Saudi Arabia for my Masters of Military Science, so I can understand that the dilemma is that to stick to who we truly are. And just sharing that for our national philosophy for Brunei Darussalam, we have the Malay Islamic monarchy. We have our intrinsic identity. And we've embedded our people that we believe in that philosophy, so that we are having our personal identity and anchoring. And this is important, Doctor, especially nowadays that all the challenges are coming from all aspects of life, be it AI, be it social media, be it from the information warfare. But we shouldn't lose ourselves. We should stick to our teaching of Islam and finding our way in the beacon of light. Before I would like to conclude, on the part of building resilience for the societies, I would like to highlight the three layers, the three strategic layers. We focus on individual, we look into societal, and we dwell into the governance aspect, because it is the human agency that brings the success or the failure of the system. It was never the system itself. Because integrity, the system doesn't have integrity, it's just a system. But people who implement it, that's why we demand the highest form of integrity, especially from leadership. And before I end my sharing session with everyone, let me say how the expectation nowadays and how we can perceive and move forward towards a better Islamic future is that we revert back towards where we start. And with that, I would like to thank you again, Doctor, for your kind question, and Tan Sri for your insightful sharing. And because of that, it has given us, each and every one of us here, it's not just about the importance of integrity, it's that we need to behave as such. That's it. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Colonel Abdul Muhib, for providing us from your experience and also providing us an insightful thoughts on this. And every time when we think normally about military leaders, we think of people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Genghis Khan. But I would say again, the Prophet himself, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a perfect military commander. As you know from history, he led the war in Perang Uhud, Perang Badr, and he was a perfect, a model military commander for the Muslim world and perhaps even to the non-Muslim world as well. And now we move on to our third panelist, and perhaps now we will focus on geopolitics, more on geopolitics, and that is with Dr. HELLYER. And so may I ask a question related to your area of expertise and what you have published, related to Middle East and also overall international security. Can you elaborate, sir, on issues related to, sovereignty and territorial boundaries, especially now we know that the war in West Asia, although we do have international law, but the lack of how do we implement or enforce international law, as was rightly mentioned by Dr. Rahman in one of the sessions. There is international law, but we see that this has constantly been violated, be it in Gaza, be it now in West Asia. In fact, the war in Iran today, was it approved or had any resolution from the United Nations Security Council or even the United States Congress itself? Was it passed in the Congress for a war to be waged to another country? So perhaps, Doctor, can you elaborate a bit more on the current state of affairs on security and also integrity from the perspective of international security? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Rogers, for the introduction and for chairing the session. And my thanks, of course, to USAS and the organizers. I see one of the main ones in the front row. Thank you, Dr. Roslan, for the invitation and for bringing together policymakers and academics and thinkers for this important discussion. And I mentioned this on the first day, but I'd like to repeat it. It's always a pleasure to be back in Malaysia, a country that I lived in for a couple of years and have been privileged to return to again and again and again, and especially in Perak, because Perak has been at the forefront of convening these sorts of discussions over recent years. I was pleased to be here 2 years ago. I'm pleased to be here again, and I hope to be here again and again. And my utmost respect and gratitude to His Royal Highness, Sultan Nazrin Shah, particularly after what I think was a real tour de force speech on the first day opening this conference, speaking about these different pillars, including national security. I can't remember the last time I heard someone of this stature or this part of society speak in such a wide-ranging way with such eloquence. So I think the people of Perak are extremely fortunate. And in regards to your question, and I have to say, whenever I hear West Asia, I always wonder if the people of West Asia use this term. You know, as somebody who's half Arab, lives in the Arab world, I don't know many Arabs who use the term West Asia, to be honest. I appreciate the imperative, but I think it's a wider discussion that we all ought to have, especially when we consider not just West Asia, but how we describe different arenas in the world, different areas in the world, where these terms come from, where the terms that we're trying to work against come from as part of the broader movement towards decolonization. But in any event, at the beginning of this conference, there was discussion around everyone matters. And I think this is both an ethical principle and a strategic necessity. You can't have national integrity, in my opinion, without ensuring something beyond simply good intentions. There has to be consistency, and there has to be a reliance on commonly held rules and universal values. And you can't have that without trust. And I brought this up in the royal session with regards to how we think about international law today. International law doesn't have an enforcement mechanism without people willing to uphold it. And what we've seen, especially in the last few years, but I would argue much further back than that, is not just a dereliction of duty, not even just an abandonment of duty when it comes to the international legal system, but completely flipping it on its head, especially around Gaza, but also now increasingly on these institutions where you have one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful country in the world, talking about essentially dismantling the International Criminal Court, penalizing countries who insist on upholding the International Criminal Court, despite the fact that this comes out of the international legal order following the Holocaust in Europe in the 40s during World War II. So it's a very precarious moment, I think, in that regard, and I don't think that people should underestimate. And you mentioned the war in the Gulf, how this war began. I think that you see violations of international law. I want to say both sides without making them equal, okay? Because of course, the war was begun by the United States and the Israelis waging an illegal war on Iran. Of course, Iranian actions thereafter are also illegal. You know, the effective closing of the straits, the attacks on different Gulf countries, but of course, they didn't happen in a vacuum. And it's quite extraordinary for me personally to see discussions around what happened in the Gulf and what's happening in the Gulf without actually covering all of these aspects, where it's either a focus on simply the US's role in the Gulf, which I think has been very damaging, of course, and I've written quite extensively about that, or focusing on the illegal actions of the Iranians on the other side. I don't see why people feel the need to only focus on one or the other. I think it's important to be able to talk about all of these things together and to hold them together if we're going to be consistent about our upholding of international law, which unfortunately I see very little of at present. When you ask about how this also came about, again, coming back to Gaza, when you have a system that is not just failing, but is implicitly empowering a lack of accountability and impunity, all it does is encourage worse, right? So I think after the last few years, when you see the impunity that was enjoyed by the State of Israel with regards to Gaza, you see the pursuit of what I call a project of Israeli paramountcy in the region, where they're not beholden to international law, where they have quote-unquote freedom of action to attack, invade, and occupy a series of countries, then of course they're going to feel emboldened to do more and to do more and to do more. Keep in mind, of course, Netanyahu tried very hard to get the Trump administration to attack Iran. Trump was not the first president to be lobbied by the Israeli Prime Minister to attack Iran. It was just that he was the first to agree. Actually, Netanyahu has been trying to do this for a very long time. So the question then becomes, how much damage is there to the world system if you have not only impunity, but the rewarding of impunity, the empowering of that impunity? And I said this on the first day, I'd like to repeat it. As much as the genocide in Gaza has been awful and terrible and continues to be, people should remember there will be other crises. There are other crises right now, but there will be more crises in the future. Today, the other crises that we talk about, of course, ought to be Sudan, Ukraine, and others. But I'm thinking in the future when we see the other crises, particularly around the climate crisis, we will all need to have some sort of reliance on an international legal system, on common values, on common solidarity. And if we move further and further away from that, where the law of the jungle becomes almost institutionalized, as it were, then it means we all suffer. It means that the vulnerable in particular, will pay the price. As much as people are cynical about these rules and these systems, which I appreciate, and I've written a great deal about it over the past few years, I caution people from thinking that the alternatives that are currently on offer are any better. On the contrary, I think that they're much worse. So I think it's really a duty upon all of us to try to find some way to salvage what we have, what is good of it, and to build something that is better. Not simply to say, okay, we're done. Because saying that really just puts the most vulnerable into the most difficult position of all. I'm not sure if that answers every aspect of your question, but if you have anything else to ask, perhaps I can address it.
Yeah, perhaps we will come back for the Q&A. Yeah, but see the term, when you mentioned about West Asia, this term has been adopted by the Malaysia's foreign ministry, or sometimes it's better known as Wisma Putra. We call those countries which was once we used to call as the Middle East as West Asia. And that's why if you look at the website of the Foreign Ministry of Malaysia, we have a West Asia desk, which covers the countries and what we call today, in the past as Middle East. So I'm using the term based on what the Foreign Ministry of Malaysia has adopted as West Asia or Asia Barat. In the past, we used to call it as Timur Tengah or Middle East. Yeah, and I think when it comes to the conflict in West Asia, yes, Malaysia has demonstrated our support for Iran. That has been mentioned by the Honorable Prime Minister. But at the same time, we need to be extremely careful because this conflict is not just between Iran, US, Israel, but also involve the other Gulf countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, because they got the effect of that war itself. They were struck. So we have to be extremely careful in terms of our foreign policy, our support, right? Because we want to have coexistence with all these countries. That is very important. And I always advocate this idea, Malaysia's foreign policy, whether you may agree or disagree, we have this mouse deer diplomacy. Mouse deer, sang kancil, right? A small animal which is timid but very wise, living in the forest, surrounded by the tigers or the elephant, much bigger, or the crocodile, but yet it is wise to survive. It can navigate itself. Of course, I use the word mouse deer, has no connotation with local politics here, but it shows how the mouse deer is wise to coexist in a rather hostile world. So that's why I always say mouse deer diplomacy of Malaysia, or diplomacy sang kancil Malaysia. All right, now we come to our fourth panelists, that is Ms. MUNIRA, MUSTAFFA. Perhaps Ms. MUNIRA, I believe you like to you present.
Assalamualaikum and good morning. Thank you, USAS and the organizers for the opportunity to speak on the panel. His Royal Highness Sultan Nazrin Shah and Berbahagia Tan Sri, along with my fellow panelists, spoke of institutional soundness, accountability, consistency, international order, and human agency as the foundation of a secure nation, and I want to take that idea and follow it as far as it will go. I hope to provide clarity because multiple things can be true all at once. The theme for this session rests on a standard I think we should take at face value. A state must be able to guarantee the basic safety of the citizens under its protection. That is the right standard. So, the question I want to examine this morning is simple. What actually delivers it? The theme proposes an answer, and it is the answer most of us in this field were trained on. Military strength, national solidarity, nation building. I have spent over 15 years working on political violence and security in this region, and deterrence matters. I will not pretend otherwise. But when we audit what is actually degrading the safety of citizens across our region today, the picture is uncomfortable. The pressure now comes from 3 different directions at once. The first pressure comes from below. Fraud syndicates operating at industrial scale from compounds across Southeast Asia. Information operations that corrode social cohesion, often by turning faith itself into a weapon. Manufacturing offense to fracture societies from within. Recruitment pipelines that treat our young men as expendable labor for other nations' wars and land grab. The second pressure comes from above. A great power order is losing the predictability that our entire region built its plans on. And the third pressure comes from alongside. Corporate actors are again accumulating capabilities we usually associate with states. So, we must ask, what do we mean by the word at the center of our theme? National integrity. We have tended to read that word territorially as the inviolability of borders, but integrity has another meaning, the soundness of the whole. A state can hold every inch of its territory and still be hollow. Its institutions weakened by capture. Its financial system exploited by criminal networks. Its information ecosystem restructured by actors it does not regulate and often cannot identify. Is that state secure? Its citizens will not say so. Let me start with what security actually is, because we often skip this step. We tend to treat security as a property of the state, something measured in force strength, hardware, and posture. But there is an older and more demanding way to understand it. Security as a condition experienced by its citizens. A population is secure when people are confident enough in the management of the risks around them to simply get on with their lives, to work, to trade, and to raise families. Security, in other words, is not what the state possesses. Security is what citizens feel and what their daily lives demonstrate. This is not a modern idea, and it is not a Western one. Ibn Khaldun made this argument in the 14th century. The strength of a polity rests on the cohesion of its people and the justice of its government. Injustice, extraction, and the decay of institutions ruin civilizations from within, long before any enemy arrives at the gate. He observed dynasties that commanded formidable armies while rotting at the core. And he identified the rot, not the enemy, as the cause of the downfall. His law exempts no one, not the dynasties he studied, not the empires that followed them, and not any power in our own era, however formidable. I want to dwell on that point because I believe it describes the most consequential fact in our security environment today. The United States commands the most formidable military capability in human history. Measured in territorial terms, no state on earth is safer. But measured by Ibn Khaldun's standard, that picture is more complicated. A society deeply polarized, its institutions strained, its foreign policy shifting faster than its partners can follow, and the cavalier disregard for norms with impunity. And I say this with no satisfaction. I do not say it as criticism of a country that remains a partner to many of us in this hall. I say it because the observation carries a consequence for us. Malaysia, like most states represented here, built its security assumptions inside an American-led order. Our trade exposure, our diplomatic habits, our planning. The predictability of the order was a benefit we never had to account for because we never had to imagine its absence. We are having to imagine it now. In tariff shocks, in security guarantees that are no longer certain, in crises that escalate faster because fewer governments are willing or able to restrain them. And while the state strain, a third shift is underway. Capabilities that once belonged only to governments are now in corporate hands. The ability to run surveillance at scale, to shape what people believe, to project influence into another society. Our entire security architecture was built on the assumption that only states could do these things. Our counterintelligence, our laws, our diplomatic law practice. That assumption no longer holds. Today, a handful of corporations hold more data on our citizens than our own governments do, and they answer to no electorate for how they use it. Capital has learned to negotiate with states the way states once negotiated with each other, sometimes to pressure them. Conditioning investment on political access, treating the enforcement of law as an affront to be punished. There are ideologies circulating in the technology world today that regard the sovereign state itself as an obsolete product, something to be disrupted, and replaced by communities of the like-minded, purchased one parcel of land at a time. Consider what our own threat perception reveals. A decade ago, when an armed group carved out territory and proclaimed a state, this region understood immediately that sovereignty was under challenge. I'm not equating the two. One sees land through atrocity, the other buys it. But sovereignty can be contested on the battlefield or in the boardroom, and an enclave that screens entry by criteria no state can inspect, founded by people who call the sovereign state obsolete, is contesting it. Only one of these was ever treated as a threat. We in this country have had recent occasion to see what that looks like in practice, and I will let the events speak for themselves. What I will say is this: our security institutions were designed decades ago to watch for insurgents. A corporate actor with capital and ambitions of self-governance was never what they were built to catch. And we should be honest that the gap is not only a design problem. When the investment is large enough, the temptation not to look too closely is one every government faces. But we must not forget our own history. This country was not first colonized by a state, but by a company. The crown followed only later. Exploitation is as old as time. It does not repeat itself so much as return in new dress. And today the dress is technology, investment, innovation too important to question. The disguise changes. The ambition underneath does not. Our own history should make us the last people on earth to mistake the costume for something new. Now, bring these three pressures back to the citizens because this is where they converge. The citizen defrauded of a lifetime savings has not suffered a border violation, but they have suffered a collapse of the confidence that makes ordinary life possible. The society whose data, attention, and economic plans sit in the hands of institutions it cannot vote for has lost control of things no border can protect. This is where institutional integrity stops being an abstraction. Institutions earn confidence the same way people do, by demonstrating over time that their conduct matches their claims, not trust as sentiment. trustworthiness as a track record, a police service that investigates without fear or favor, an intelligence apparatus that operates within the law and answers to somebody. Where that track record exists, citizens extend confidence, investors commit. Partner states share what they know. Where that track record is absent, no quantity of military capability substitutes for it. Capability tells you what a state can do. Integrity tells you what it will do. And notice what follows. We cannot legislate away the strains of great powers. We cannot deter a fraud syndicate with a frigate. We cannot uninvent the technologies that concentrated so much power in corporate hands. But the soundness of our own institutions answers all three. In a world growing less predictable, our institutions are the one security asset entirely within our control. The only discipline this demands is that the methods we use to protect ordinary life must not themselves degrade it. A state that answers every threat by expanding surveillance and narrowing civic space may win each contest and still lose the very thing it was defending. So, the question is never only whether our states are strong enough to act. The question is whether our institutions are sound enough to act well. Conduct matching claims applies to modern institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, that same test applies to our own vocabulary. Our theme speaks of wars between states. Yet for most citizens in our region, the political violence of the past 2 decades did not come from wars between states. We called it terrorism, and that word deserves scrutiny. Terrorism has never been a neutral description. No agreed international definition exists. The reason is not technical. States have never wanted their allies included or their adversaries excluded. The label answers to politics, and the Muslim world knows the cost of the arrangement better than anyone. For 20 years, when a perpetrator was Muslim, the verdict came first, the evidence came later, if it came at all. Now, watch what happens when the pattern reverses. White supremacist violence draws on a tradition more than a century old, its own texts, its own genealogy, its own logic of choosing targets. Yet, when these attackers strike, we are told the ideology was mixed, unclear, a salad bar. The poor man was simply troubled. These classifications are reductive, and they define a coherent and growing threat. That is not incoherence in the perpetrator. That is a failure of literacy in the analysis. Some of what is emerging is genuinely new, and new categories for it are legitimate. The failure is not that we built them. The failure is that we apply them according to who the perpetrator is. For one man, no proof is required. For the other, no charge ever sticks. A field that does both has told you something about itself. Its definitions answers to politics, not to conduct. The remedy is consistency. Standards applied without exemption to adversaries, to allies, and to ourselves. That last word is where this gets uncomfortable, so let me apply it to our own country first. Our theme names the 2 conflicts that have divided the world into camps. On one of them, I will not pretend to a neutrality that I do not subscribe to. Gaza is under siege, Palestine is still under illegal occupation, and the accounting for both remains unfinished. But if we demand consistent standards from others, we must be able to survive that same audit. In 2014, a missile destroyed a civilian airliner over Ukraine. 298 souls were killed, 43 of them were ours on a Malaysian flag carrier. There has been no apology, there have been no reparations, and there has been from us no sustained demand for either. We weighed a bilateral relationship and we chose quiet. Every small state makes such calculations, I understand them. But we should name them accurately, and capitulation is not diplomacy. Non-alignment was never silence. The founders of that movement were among the loudest voices of their era, precisely because they answered to principles rather than to camps. A region that demands accountability for its dead in one conflict while declining to demand it in another is not non-aligned. That is selective accountability, the very practice we criticize in others. So, we owe ourselves an honest question about our quiet. Is it a strategy, or is it a symptom? Some will answer the great power turbulence is distant and that distance permits discretion. Distance is not insulation. Neither is neutrality. The Hormuz crisis began in capital thousands of kilometers away, and within days, a strait most people could not place on a map had reprised energy across this region. Malaysia sits astride one of the most consequential corridors in the global economy. Every camp courts our publics through information operations to recruit our sympathies. A neutrality that others can exploit is not a shield. Enforced impartially, neutrality is a strategy. Unenforced, neutrality is an open door. States in opposition do not get to choose whether the strains of great powers concern them. The only choice available is whether to meet them with standards or with reflexes. So let me return to where our theme began. A state must guarantee the basic safety of the citizens under its protection. My argument this morning has been that this guarantee is no longer purchased primarily with hardware. The guarantee rests on the soundness of our own institutions, the cohesion of our societies, the consistency of our standards. This, in truth, what our own doctrine of total defense has always recognized, that security is not the work of the armed forces alone, but of every institution and every citizen. And none of this is solitary work, not out of sentiment, but out of arithmetic. No middle power can enforce standards against a syndicate or a superpower alone. The states that built non-alignment understood this. Ibn Khaldun taught that civilizations are rarely destroyed from without before they are weakened from within. And the corollary is the encouraging part. What is built from within cannot easily be taken from without. So let me end with the question I keep returning to. When the anchor states of this world are themselves straining, will the Muslim world spend this decade choosing a camp? Or will we build the institutional integrity that makes the choice unnecessary? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Munira, for the presentation. We still have quite some time. The session is supposed to end by 10:50. So before we open up for the Q&A from the audience, may I maybe ask questions to the panelists? And then after that, we will come to the round of the Q&A from the audience. So I will start off maybe with Tan Sri. Tan Sri, you have highlighted about the importance of integrity. As I quote you, that there are two pillars here. You have integrity, one pillar, and security. Yeah. So given in this modern age, we also embark on AI, digital. So Tan Sri, can you elaborate a bit more on how do we manage integrity in this world of digitization? And that question.
Well, Mr. Moderator, this is a very interesting question. I agree with you fully that the new threat to our society is about cybersecurity and AI. Nowadays, it seems everybody is talking about AI. AI has its good side and also the bad side. So I think the government and those who are knowledgeable about this must work together to ensure that the whole system doesn't collapse. Must give assurance to the public that, for example, the data security, everyone are well protected. And also the data of our people being shared with other countries and whatnot beyond our control. I'm quite worried about that actually. Because in terms of security, that is very important. So we should always make sure that we are on top of the situation, rather than see things happen badly and then regret that we didn't take action at the right time, at the right place. Yeah. But I fully agree with you. Cybersecurity, AI present both opportunities and threat to the country, any country for that matter. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri. Well, then we come to Lieutenant Colonel ABDUL. You highlighted about the Western and how we want to inculcate our local values, all right? When it comes to the military setup, both Malaysia, Brunei, our armed forces were set up or introduced by the British. Therefore, our military institution is very much British centered. Not just Malaysia, Brunei, but I think even India, Pakistan, as well as Bangladesh, all the Commonwealth countries. But in recent years, there are also attempts to bring in our local values. So, sir, can you elaborate, because this is also very much related to integrity and security, yeah, on perhaps even process of Islamization of the armed forces that happens in Brunei and even our Malaysian armed forces, ATM, Angkatan Tentera Malaysia. So can you elaborate on a bit on?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moderator. It is important for us to understand that before this, we've come a long way in terms of military. So we didn't just come up with all these tactic doctrines, thinking, all these systems. But when we talk about value, doctors and ma'am, ladies and gentlemen, we are allowed to have our own values. Maybe the tactics we have to follow are standardized. For example, when we look into the way of training, for example, but our own individual societal values, we shouldn't lose it. For example, when in RBAF, we have SETIA, Taqwa, Berani, and Professional, which is loyalty, piety, professional, and courage. So when we look at this, and because I'm coming from a different integration of military, I was trained as a recruit for 6 months. I was trained again for a year in Brunei. And again, I was trained for a year in the UK. And then I was again joined Malaysian battalion for a year plus when we were deployed in Lebanon in 2014. And again, after that, I went to Saudi Arabia for a year for a course, for my command and staff course. So these values, when we go there, for example, we are taking the good values and integrate it. And that's how Islam comes to our civilization. And the hardest part for this is that we sometimes think that we must lose ourselves in order to become or to be successful. So, in short, when we look into values in terms of military, we are allowed to remain who we are, especially if it's a good values, for example. And in doing so, we are integrating and taking the good practices, the best practices, to make sure that we are become the khairu ummah. We are becoming the best ummah. Because when we talk about the best ummah or the best civilization, it doesn't mean we must be the one who's 100 years ago, no. We are Islam is so flexible that it allows us to integrate without losing ourselves and while maintaining our national or our identity. And that would be my answer, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tuan, for the response. And now I come to Dr. HELLYER. So last year, the world commemorated the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations, 1945. And at that time, there were a lot of hopes and aspiration on multilateralism, peaceful coexistence as being enshrined in the United Nations Charter. But in recent times, we see multilateralism is being eroded time and again. Rather, it is more of a unilateral action, and the issue of peaceful coexistence is very much being challenged. So, in your view, how can we uphold these concepts, or are these concepts totally beyond, I would say, coming back again? This is what we hope for, you know, in a multilateral world, peaceful coexistence. But in recent times, we see how states have taken action unilaterally, and it appears that force is the order of the day rather than, you know, peaceful coexistence. So can you elaborate whether can we still uphold these values anymore? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I mentioned in my remarks the word consistency. And if you want a truly cohesive, constructive, and effective multilateral system, then consistency will underpin all of that. And it builds trust in the multilateral system among the nations of the world. So we can't talk about Ukraine without talking about Gaza. We can't talk about Gaza without talking about Sudan. We can't talk about Sudan without talking about Syria under the Assad regime. Thankfully no longer. But unfortunately, you find different objections in different parts of the world with regards to inconsistency that are themselves not consistent. So if you have, for example, forces that are arguing against Israel's genocide in Gaza and what I mentioned as the paramountcy project in the region, but they found it acceptable that Russia invaded and occupied parts of Ukraine, or that Iran assisted in the Assad's regime destruction of Syria, then I don't think people will find this consistent. And I don't think people will trust the multilateral system accordingly. If we're going to have a multilateral system underpinned by international law, then we have to be very clear about all violations of international law. Otherwise, this isn't law, it's not an aspiration towards common values, it's simply politics, and very partisan politics at that. As Tuanku said on the first day, everyone matters. Everyone is imbued with essential dignity and honor. And even if it's inconvenient, which I think this is the case in many political discussions, all people's rights, all people's fundamental rights ought to be respected and upheld. So if we want a multilateral system that truly works, we have to be consistent in upholding those essential values for everybody, irrespective of who they are, and indeed who's carrying out the violations.
Right. Thank you very much for your response. And I think one area which we also need to focus a lot is what we call second track diplomacy. Of course, first track diplomacy consists of the traditional sense where states, diplomats are being sent abroad. That's why we have the foreign ministry of various countries. But first track has its own limitations because they operate within the scope that has been set out by the Vienna Convention on diplomacy and consulate. So they have do's and don'ts. Whereas when we come to second track diplomacy, where we have non-state actors, because they are not governed by the international law or the Vienna Convention. So they are more free to discuss or elaborate. Perhaps even a conference like this, which is an academic conference, can be a form of second track diplomacy, where we have perhaps professors, even NGOs, to discuss on issues. They are more free to discuss compared to diplomats, because diplomats, they have their, as I said, do's and don'ts for them to abide. And we have to focus as well in today's world. Perhaps second track diplomacy plays a crucial role. We have the participation of NGOs, like-minded people, to bring issues up to the policy makers. And now we come, and in relations to these non-state actors, perhaps I would like to ask Ms. Munira, as you have dealt a lot or done a lot of study and research on terrorism, and unfortunately sometimes there have been typecasting about people who are considered, part of this group and all. So can you elaborate on a bit more on this issue on terrorism and efforts of counter-terrorism, and unfortunately, sometimes this Islamophobia that has been typecasted by the West for, they have their own agenda. So Ms. Munira, perhaps you can elaborate on this. Thank you. It's on.
It's just me being smaller than, sorry.
No, it's fine, don't worry.
So as you were saying, I think my biggest criticism of the terrorism or counterterrorism field is the agenda setting. And I think it's largely because of what happened 20, 30 years ago. And there's a persistent belief that it is about the pitting of the Muslim world versus the non-Muslim world. And at the start of my career, that was the mindset I had, because you grow up being surrounded by all these narratives, and so naturally when you enter the industry, that's a narrative that you've met with. But I feel like I come from a very critical counterterrorism perspective as well, thankfully for that. So I have no qualms about criticizing approaches both by state and non-state actors alike, both by agencies or even the CSOs, NGOs, because I feel like there is a persistent and stubborn attachment to labels. People throw around the word extremism and terrorism very loosely without thinking the weight behind those labels, for one thing, and that's my biggest issue with it. Just because someone's dressed up in a very traditional garb or something, they automatically, immediately assume that the person is Islam. What does Islamists even mean these days? Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling, but I think the most troubling aspect is that over time, and looking at the threat landscape right now, there's still the persistent belief that ISIS is still a relevant threat, and I respectfully disagree with it, because I think that when you want to analyze the threat factor about extremism, terrorism, you have to account for the present political environment. Sometimes the tensions, the crisis emerge because of the shape and what's going on in the political landscape at the time. So that is why we're seeing it in waves, and I feel like even looking back at then, I still have my own personal criticisms of David Rappaport's work. I'm sure you've seen, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Rappaport's work. He talked about the 4 waves of terrorism, and he talked them like in terms of blocks. Like first it was the nationalists, and then it was the socialists, and then it moved to Islamists, jihadists, and now, they call it the salad bar now. And I feel like that is the problem, because they're attaching it to that kind of identity, the kind of religious, tabula religious. But the thing is, those are the most consistent things about human nature for centuries. And I feel like the reductive assigning of these labels is only convenient for the political matters at the time, but it doesn't explain why we're seeing the kind of threat that evolved today, and why, this is why my criticism is with people trying to insist that ISIS is still a problem. But you see, you have to account for what happened 10 years ago. It was different. Last time we had, why did terrorism evolve the way they did? It's because of the political experiences of other regions that evolved into that kind of, experiences or waves. You had the Iran Revolution, and then the Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyah, 9/11, and then ISIS. But they don't just happen in a vacuum, they happen in consequence. And then in 2017, the caliphate has collapsed. And in my opinion, maybe some people might disagree with me, because, yes, I agree that there is still ISIS threat in some parts of the world, but it's not, they all have broken up, that they're no longer working towards that unified ambition of the Grand Caliphate as they once did, because it's not realistic. Holding territory is not realistic. So you're more likely to see disparate elements of extremism today, and it's largely to do with kind of people's relationship with online as well, because the online I hate separating the online and the offline because I feel like we're also projecting ourselves online as much as it's offline. So everything's relevant. But you're seeing like the emergence of a new kind of extremism today. A lot of people have different labels for it. Like in America, they call it salad bar extremism, which I inherently disagree with. But there's also a new argument to be made about the misanthropic and nihilistic nature of extremism today, which is also quite logical if you understand the world today, because I feel like my unpopular argument to explain that is because I feel like today's society has been cleaved into two parts. You're either an influencer or you're not an influencer. That's all it boils down to. This is all about influencing people's opinions and values and their ideas and concepts of what should be normalized, what should be rejected. So I feel like, the whole concept of, you want to call it jihadi terrorism, I feel like it's a reductive way to look at it, because nowadays, if you look at the youth today, they're not particularly invested in what Abu Bakr Baghdadi had to say 10 years ago. But what they attach to is the idea of power. They want to express themselves in a sense of power and agency because they feel so pessimistic. Because, if you talk to any youth today about how they see themselves in the future, again, you're going to get some kids saying that I would like to be on TikTok. I want to be on Instagram. But if you look at it granularly, it's all about wanting to be an influencer or you don't want to be an influencer. And I feel like that also explains a lot of the attacks as you're seeing today. You're seeing a lot more mass casualty violence. Last week alone, I think in 3 different countries, you have youth-perpetrated attacks in schools and in public spaces. And again, if you follow the thread, it all goes back to online about who they've been conversing with, because they don't find any relationship offline, but they find some common overlapping relationship online. So that's that push and pull factor. But again, I feel like there's also the reductive attitude towards this as well, because when we have school attacks, for instance, the most immediate assumption that it must be computer games, it must be the media, it must be K-pop. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to understand, why do people carry out attack? Why do they select that target, and what motivates them? And it often, it's not just a simply reduction explanation of, it's because of religious belief or because of games or whatever. You have to understand the motivation behind that. So I feel like, even if you want to stratify that according to youth attack, but there's so many elements of people being more disparate. You're not seeing that kind of organized structure of extremists like we did 10 years ago, because that's what they needed to mobilize themselves. But today, they have a more ability and capability to operate on their own because of their access to tools, to networks, to various things that to allow them to express their violent tendencies. So that is why I feel like we need to move away from the idea of religion is causing this or the ideology attachment. We have to understand why perpetrators behave the way they do.
Thank you so much, Ms. Munira. I think we need to look into the root cause of the phenomena. And since we have the presence of Lieutenant Colonel Muhammad MUJIB, I think both our armed forces, this is more of a comment, both our armed forces, be it the Royal Brunei Armed Forces and even our Malaysian Armed Forces, we are one of the few that are very professional in that sense that in terms of the civil-military relations, since the establishment or since our independence, there was never a coup d'etat in our countries. We should not take this for granted. If you look at within this region, Southeast Asia or ASEAN members, we have our neighbors who have experienced time and again of coup d'etat, military takeover. I don't need to name those countries, but you know those from within our own region. And even in a larger context in the Islamic world, Pakistan, Bangladesh, even Nigeria, they have experienced these coup d'etats, military coup d'etats, but yet our armed forces have been fairly professional. We take care of what we are supposed to do, that is on security. I think that is something which we should give credit to our armed forces All right, now we come to the third part, that is the Q&A from the audience. So may I invite questions from the floor? Please make it brief and introduce yourself and go straight to your question, or even your comment based on what has been presented by the eminent panelists. Any questions? Yes, sir. Datuk Rahman. And then there's the gentleman behind. Maybe we collect 3 questions for the first round. Then if we have time, we move on to the second round. Yes, Datuk, dipersilakan, Datuk.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I just want to ask this question regarding national integrity, perhaps to Tan Sri and also Lieutenant Colonel. I remember when I was in school, we have this subject called civic. And then in religious school, we have the subject of adab. Not sure whether we have that today. You know, the more we talk about Islam and the more we talk about being or having integrity, the more we have cases on corruption in our country. So what is the root cause of this corrupt practice? Perhaps we have to look at education. We must have probably a compulsory subject. And the important thing is the realization that, as you said, Tan Sri, it has an impact. It has an economic impact to the country. If you are a leader, for example, how is it that you are, allured to this kind of practices? And is it because of economic background? I just don't understand. Perhaps you can elaborate on this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Datuk, for the question. Yes, we have the next question. Please,
silakan. Okay, terima kasih. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning. My name is Azmil bin Zulkifli. I'm from Universiti Ustaz Zahid Shah. There's one issue and also the question. Okay, I still remember that Ms. MUNIRA talked about terrorism, and it reminds me actually of the opening scene of the movie Braveheart. The narrator said that history are written by those who kill heroes. Okay, a terrorism for someone, a hero for someone else. In our history, we can look in the Perak history, we have Dato' Maharaja Lela. He was a hero for Malays, but in the eyes of the British at that time, he was a terrorist because he killed J.W.W. Birch. Okay, this will go to my question actually, because today we are talking about integrity and security. And as we know, this is an open issue that has been deliberated in the media. For example, the purchase of our littoral combatant ship, the LCS. This is where Dato' Maharaja Lela come because the name of our first ship supposed to be KD Maharaja Lela. And before that, we do have another problem with our Navy's purchase. Way back in the 1990s, the NGPV, the new generation patrol vessel, which the Navy wanted 27 new vessels, but at the end, they only get 6. Okay, this is where I want to relate about integrity and about my question, because as we see, integrity is usually related to corrupt practice. But in my observation, in ASEAN region, there are countries that is ranked lower than Malaysia in the corruption index, but their military get what they want. For example, I will not name the country, but that military, they wanted the new tank, they got the Leopard, the latest Leopard tank. They want the jet, they got the latest Rafale F4 fighter jet, which is one of the state-of-the-art, most advanced jet in the market. So, is there any relationship this is my question. How about patriotism, or actually the lack of patriotism in our policymakers, in our decision makers, led to this issue? I think I'm going to open the question to all the panelists. Thank you very much.
So just to summarize, the importance of patriotism, right? Yeah.
Patriotism or the lack of it, because we can see that integrity is part of it, I believe so.
Yeah.
But sometimes when we look into the issue, because some countries, they are ranked lower than us in terms of the corruption perception, but they still get what they want.
Thank you. Yeah. So maybe we address the first question, Tan Sri, to the question raised by Dato' Rahman.
Okay, let me comment on the first and second question.
Yes.
And I want to relate it to the issue of procurement in the defense. What I can say is that your fear about corruption cases getting worse, I tend to agree with you, because if you trace back these cases of corruption, some of them or most of them originated from audit reports. But if you look at the audit report, audit normally carry only a small sample. Even within a small sample, you already find cases, of such nature. But what is interesting is that because of integrity problem, the country suffers. Number one, in terms of defense preparedness. And this has happened in the Malaysian scene. I wouldn't say just the Navy, it would cover even Air Force and this one. I don't need to go into detail, but what I want to highlight is the fact that not only it creates losses for the government in the billions, but also it's going to affect the security and the morale of our soldiers. I agree that our armed forces, they always behave professionally and whatnot, but they also need weapons of the right size, of the right quality. And if they don't get it, it will impact on their work. So on the question of why this thing happened, I think there are many factors. Some poor leadership, lack of supervision, checks, and the contracts are not well managed. Sometimes they don't understand what in the contract also. So how are you going to ensure that the vendors and the contractors follow the specs and whatnot? And there's a lot of money to be made in government procurement, billions of dollars. So I'm very happy that my friend from Brunei mentioned about fear of God. Fear of God. So first fear is that we are losing money in terms of quantity, large. And it will continue to happen if the culture is still the same. There's no God-fearing. And that element, to me, is very essential. And it's not easy, in our situation, because government has to face competing requests from the public, the various sectors, health, education, and whatnot. But at the same time, the defense sector is also a very important sector. So given the money that is given to them, already there are problems, So this brings me to the basic issue. How do people handle public money? They cannot do a good job if they don't have integrity. They cannot have integrity if they are not God-fearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri. Thank you. Maybe we address the second question. Anyone would like to address? Yes, please, sir.
So thank you for the question. You mentioned something about terrorism to begin with. I confess I don't really understand the link between your comment and your question, but I wanted to address the comment. because the issue of terrorism is something I've dealt with for the past 20 years. In fact, I began my career after the 7th of July bombings in London, in the UK. And I come from a background where my father, God rest his soul, was active in the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. And of course, the anti-apartheid movement was described as terrorist. Mandela was described as a terrorist. And then, of course, that all changed, right? And now it'll be very difficult for you to find somebody who will describe Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. But certainly during his lifetime, especially during the 70s and the 80s, that was not the case. And the term itself is very difficult because you don't have an internationally recognized consensus on the definition of terrorism. You have different countries institutionalizing this in a legal framework in different places, and you have that here. You have that in Malaysia. You have a legally upheld definition, but it's on a national level. It's not on an international level. And I think that if we want to, again, coming back to the theme of consistency and also where everyone matters, we need to have certain, very clear baselines that everybody agrees to. Otherwise we turn the term, and not just the term of terrorism, but of extremism, of radical extremism, and so on, they become incredibly elastic and essentially meaningless, right? Because they simply become political tools to attack our opponents as opposed to actually defining a phenomenon. And that makes it very, very difficult. I'd be cautious because in different contexts, I've seen people raise this sort of objection and complaint, but what they're really upset about is that their chosen political cause is being problematized. They don't actually have a problem with unfair problematization. They just have the problem when it happens to them. And you can see this in discussions around the Arab world in particular, but also elsewhere. So I would encourage you and myself and all of us to think of ways to be consistent, to uphold universal standards, to create those universal standards so that we come to a consensus that we're all bound to, that we all find unacceptable, and that we all problematize in a just and legitimate manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Follow up on that commentary. Firstly, I want to integrate the meaning of terrorism. What is terrorism? So there is no agreed definition or consensus on what is terrorism, but the most basic capture for that term is that it's non-state political violence. It is not terrorism without any political objective. That's one thing we have to remember. And secondly, I think it would be a lot helpful to view terrorism as a tactic, not ideology. And people's impulse is that they always treat terrorism as an ideology. It's like they will go like, oh, ideology, terrorist, ideology. It is not an ideology. Terrorism is tactic, and I don't care what other people say. This is from my own experience and how I've been viewing it through that analytical lens. I've been treating terrorism as a tool. And the reason that it's very loaded, it's partly because of the history of terrorism. I'm just going to ignore the French part of the history of terrorism, but we have to see it from the colonial perspective as well. They've been assigning that term on any insurgents trying to resist its colonial structures, because that's what it's all about. This is all about pacification. This is also another thing that we have to recall. And this is where I want to clearly delineate why some groups are called terrorists and some aren't. You have to remember the unilateral classification. You have also to remember that different countries have different lists of designation of terrorists. So one country might prescribe one group as a terrorist, the other might not. They're not obligated to. But some countries, like Malaysia, for instance, we subscribe to the UN National Security Council's list of designated terrorists. That is the one that we respect, but we also have our own list that other countries are not obligated to follow. That is our classification based on what we perceive as the current threat perception. The other thing I want to dive into about terrorism is that part of the reason why this confusion happens is also largely because of what ISIS had left behind for us. Because ISIS had this extremist view of, the Islamic Caliphate, what have yous, but they also use terrorism as their main strategy. So this is what you need to understand. That is the reason why many countries designated ISIS as a terrorist group, mainly because they use terrorism as a tactic, as a force of coercion, as opposed to other groups that may be designated only as militant group, but not terrorist groups. You must understand the difference between militancy and terrorism. They're not the same thing. Militant groups may use terrorism as tactic, but they're not necessarily terrorists. I hope that clarifies things.
Thank you. Oh, okay, right.
Just answering to what Dato was asking earlier, I would like to highlight, why do we realize now there's so many problems? Because one is that we are more aware. We are more aware what's wrong nowadays. Because one, the tools of education. Two, we are more open and we understand, we compare, we analyze. And because of that, I would like to answer in a brief
perhaps
summary.
In a minute, because we are running short of time.
One is that at the individual level, we must impose the value of taqwa, the fear. We must be fearful. Because, and being fearful as well, we must believe in it. The second part is that at the societal level, we must encourage. We must encourage and accept this as a part of our value. And the third level, at the governance level, we must practice it. And therefore, if we want to address all of this concern, especially on terrorism, on the corruption and whatnot, we must understand the three layers. It works together to form a cohesive and resilient society. That's all. Thank you so
much to all the panelists. I'm sure you will agree with me, for the past close to 2 hours, we have been fed with a lot of ideas while we had our breakfast earlier on for our bodies. But now, the last 2 hours, we have been fed with a lot of ideas and thoughts. And it's worthwhile for all of us here to stay back to the last day. Didn't I say that? It's worthwhile. Thank you so much. So let us give them a round of applause. And also to those who have participated in the Q&A, thank you very much for your participation. So with that, I'll pass it back to the Master of Ceremony.
Once again, a big hand, ladies and gentlemen, to the able moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers. And thank you once again to our panel of speakers consisting of 4 distinguished speakers. Thank you. You may now leave the stage if you'd like to. Dr. H.A. HELLYER, thank you very much, sir. Nice to see you again. Of course, he spoke about lots of topics on the world stage. Thank you very much to Tan Sri Dato Sri HAJI AMBRIN BUANG. Of course, he is the former Auditor-General of Malaysia who speaks about every single cent that Malaysia has. Thank you to Ms. MUNIRA MUSTAFFA. She is, of course, with MIDIO and also Lieutenant Colonel Abdul Mujib Haji Jafar. He happens to be the Acting Director of Royal Brunei Armed Forces, RBAF Religious Directorate. Thank you once again. They have a group photo here for remembrance. And this, ladies and gentlemen, our session, the 5th session, National Integrity and Security. Please look at the camera, ladies and gentlemen, for a special photo for us to keep an etch in the history of WCIT 2026. Thank you once again, and ribuan terima kasih. We now move on, ladies and gentlemen.